In those days, there were bad times and hard times. The Roman Empire ruled the land as an all-encompassing, dominating force. It exploited working people, it overfished lakes, it mined mountains, all to send wealth to Roman coffers. It ruled through puppet kings and the allies among the powerful. It demanded worship of an emperor who ruled by force and built shrines and temples celebrating its own power. Anyone who objected was run over by a Roman legion or nailed to a Roman cross. And though that Roman Empire is long gone today, its habits lived on in many an economic system since. But in those days, a teacher came along, one who promised freedom for his people, and from the start, he seemed a little different. He taught that the problem wasn't just who is in charge of the empire, but everything that the empire represents. The very idea of dominating others, of power being defined as the ability to make somebody else feel powerless, of tolerating misery for the many in order to create luxury for the few, of applauding pride and selfishness, of celebrating violence. He taught that this way of thinking sneaks into how we relate to each other, how we think about ourselves, that it creates violence and fear and anger. And he taught that by changing how we connect to each other, we can change the world all around us through joy, through laughter, through love and service. Most of all, he taught about God. God who loves everyone, but has a special love for the poor and the vulnerable, the widow, the outcast, anyone who lived at the edges of society then or now. Anyone at the mercy of a powerful majority that degrades them, shames them, makes them suffer, then or now. God who does not work like a mighty emperor, who does not play that empire's game, who does not let injustice win, but overcomes it, not by turning vengeance upon God's enemies, but by suffering on their behalf. God who speaks of hope, God who was the source of hope for 1,000 generations, who knew what it was like to go through hard times, through bad times. And some of us know a thing or two about bad times. For some of us, it is illness and sickness, the brutal marathon of hunting for a job, troubles in our relationships, worries for our kids, the search for housing, a rocky situation at work. And I've talked to many of the people in this congregation over the last 2 weeks, and many of you are worried about the direction of our country after this past election. And the people I hear from are not sad because one team lost, like it's just some big sporting event. And no one is naively pretending like either political party actually represents the kingdom of God on earth. Everyone knows that war and climate chaos still stalk our path, and that a deeper transformation of our world is needed. A spiritual rebirth is called for. We know that followers of Jesus can and should disagree. Everyone I talk to wants to be part of an inclusive community where we can be challenged by people with different perspective, different political views, different ideas. But many of you have looked at our president-elect and said, if this particular man can get elected with what he has done and admitted to and been found liable of doing and what he has promised to do, many of you have said, I worry we are in bad times indeed. You would like to be wrong, but the worry persists. And so we return to those days and that teacher, and this exchange in Mark between teacher and students who talks of days that seem full of chaos and perhaps predictions for a dark future. And if that is where we left it, it would not be the gospel, for the gospel is and always will be good news. And the good news here in this confusing and crazy-sounding passage is this: bad times are not end times. Hard times are not end times. God's story does not end here. Your story does not end here. The things we are up against, no matter how mighty they seem, no matter how invincible and indestructible, these too will come tumbling down. To explain, we must remember that this teacher stands in the tradition of prophets, and prophets in that culture were never merely predicting the future, they were always speaking truth to power in the present. When they said this awful thing is going to happen in the future, it was always to tell someone or some people they need to change their ways in the present. It is the Old Testament way of saying if you act a fool in the present, you're gonna find out in the future. With God's truth on their lips, these prophets guided generation after generation to hope beyond their hard times. And this teacher also came along at a time when there was a popular form of writing called the apocalypse. And he might be pretty confused today by what that word has come to represent, because in those days, apocalypse simply meant unveiling, a revealing. It was a literary genre that used visions and symbols as a kind of code to reveal the truth of the world as seen through the eyes of God, written by people who did not have social or political or military or economic power, but believed that God would not abandon them. Imagine, if you will, you picked up a book that said it was a science fiction novel written in 1950 by an African-American author in the Jim Crow South. And this book is about a future, 100 years from now, where aliens come to Earth and oppress human beings, take away their rights, don't let them drink from the same water fountains or use the same restaurants, make them sit at the back of the bus, take away their voice in public, and threaten them with violence if they act out of line. You'd probably start to figure out, this isn't about predicting the future, is it? This is a commentary on what's going on in this person's world. And that is how we should be thinking about the genre called apocalypse. This passage we have here in Mark starts what scholars call the little apocalypse, because it's not very long. And coincidentally, the little apocalypse feels like a really good description of every week for like the last 10 years, maybe most of my adult life. I don't know if you can relate. Our little apocalypse begins like this. A student says to his teacher, "Look at the wealth and power of this city. Look at this temple. Wouldn't that be nice to have? I mean, those stones are too large. Those buildings are too grand to ever collapse or be torn down, but maybe we could take them over and play the same game, but with different winners, different losers." And the teacher says, "No. What you think is untouchable will be thrown down. Not one stone will be left." And our teacher was not anti-Jewish. He's not foreseeing the destruction of the temple because he hated Jewish laws or Jewish customs or Jewish worship. He was a good and devout Jew. He had just spent days preaching and teaching in that temple. But he was revealing something that many of them had only suspected, that the leaders of this particular temple system at this particular point in time, the temple system itself had centralized control of God, become gatekeepers of faith, had made an unholy peace with the violence of the empire around them. It said to Rome, "We'll look the other way while you crush the least of these among us. We'll pretend not to see the misery this system creates. We'll give you God's stamp of approval, or at least pretend that God doesn't mind so much, in exchange for our own peace and our own sense of dominance. This temple system had traded in the God of their ancestors, the God of nomads who practiced hospitality, of slaves who marched to freedom, of Rachel and Hagar, of Miriam and Deborah, of prophets who denounced those who crush the poor, the God of Hannah, who gave thanks to God because the bows of the mighty are broken, but the feeble gird on strength. Those who were full have hired themselves out for bread, but those who are hungry are fat with spoil. The Lord raises up the poor from the dust. The Lord lifts the needy from the ash heap. The Lord will guard the feet of God's faithful ones, but the wicked will perish in darkness, for not by might does one prevail. The temple system had taken that legacy and traded it for a pinch of political power, for ethnic nationalism and dominance over their enemies, and the belief that strong and mighty ones will always win. Totally unrelatable, no hysterical parallels. Move right along, nothing to see here. And maybe all that seemed invincible. I can see it. Maybe whatever you're going through, whatever bad time, hard time you're experiencing, the challenges before you do actually seem unconquerable. And maybe you think you need to rule over other people to find some security, to have some sort of strength to meet those challenges. But no, this teacher says. Because in Jesus Christ, our power flows from the crucified Lord, not our ability to make other people feel powerless. In Jesus, your freedom is not measured in what you can get away with, but how much you can love the way Christ loved. Your deliverance is both of this world and not, so that you can trust that God never ordains misery in this life, but also that the misery we inflict on each other in this life is never the end of God's story. So the teacher says, no institution lasts forever, especially those who crush the beloved children of God. Even this will be thrown down. But when? When, right? How will we know? All the students gather around to ask, and what he said in reply: kingdom against kingdom, war and rumor of war, famine. That was never meant to be a clear prediction of our future. If he's predicting anything, it's that this fake peace of his time with the Romans would not last, that they would conquer again, kill thousands, and raze the temple to the ground. And all that happened about 30 years later. But I don't think he spoke those words so we could predict our future. He didn't speak these words so we can look at a newspaper and connect the dots and set a date. He didn't drop hints and clues that your aunt and uncle can piece together for you over Thanksgiving dinner while trying to convince you to invest in gold or Bitcoin. He calls these bad times birth pangs. Instead of a prediction, he is offering the possibilities of life with God, the chance to give birth to something new from amidst ruin. One of the challenges for our time is to reclaim this apocalyptic language, because throughout history there have been those who used it to pretend the world was ending when it was just their own dominance being challenged, who wanted to scare people into being so afraid of their neighbor that they would think the way of Christ was too weak to continue. But there have also been others, some who seem foolish now for their failed predictions, some who seem naive in their hope of what they could build, but all of whom who saw this language as full of possibility, who found in it a promise that no matter how impossible the odds, the absolute markers of bad times, I know how bad things get, we can dare to dream beyond the ugliness. We can start living now as if a better world is on the way. When everything falls apart, when you are going through the worst moment in your life, when you're worried about your future or your community's future, this teacher says it's not God that's breaking. It's your false idols, your doctrines you've held on to for too long, convictions you don't need anymore. It's not God crumbling down. It's whatever large building you built out of such large stones to protect yourself. It's whatever kept you from truly loving the person next to you, the stranger you saw on the street, your true self deep inside that you find hard to love. It's whatever system or doctrine or belief or economic structure kept you from being of service to them and made you want to rule them instead. That's what's falling down. And it will fall away. But God will still be there. The God of resurrection after death. And so now this teacher says, now is not the time to surrender to anyone spouting fear or bigotry, but to dream of new belonging. In the midst of what seems like chaos, this is the time to experiment with new ways of belonging to each other, to recommit yourself to following the Prince of Peace, to dare to dream of something better, not for just you or for just one person, but for all of us. And to see the world this way, it's not easy. It's a choice. And when your life is falling apart, few of us can stop to think about the new thing around the corner, right? It takes an act of faith. But that faith is there for us. It is recorded in the stories that ancestors passed down that we call the Bible. It is available in a hug or a quiet word from someone in a community like this. It is there in quiet, still moments of prayer. Hard times are not end times. They are birth pangs. Our teacher, our Jesus, does not give us an ending date we can mark on a calendar. He simply reassures us that love can survive any hardship, because love is from God, and everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. And where love and God are, there too is a chance for belonging and new beginnings, for true freedom, for true connection, for safety and dignity and abundant life for all peoples. Bad times are not end times. Your story does not end here. God's story does not end here. So if we choose to believe, we stand in a moment of birth pangs. Let's hold hands and take deep breaths and sing and help God, the Creator, bring birth to something new.